Recording by Krista Zaleski. The Chronic Argonauts by H.G. Wells. Section 1. Being the account of Dr. Nebo Gipfel's sojourn in Shathuth, about half a mile outside the village of Shathuth, by the road that goes up over the eastern flank of the mountain called Pennapush to Rustog, is a large farm building known as the Manse. It derives this title from the fact that it was at one time the residence of the minister of the Calvinistic Methodists. It is a quaint, low, irregular erection, lying back some 100 yards from the railway, and now fast passing into a ruinous state. Since its construction in the latter half of the last century, this house has undergone many changes of fortune, having been abandoned long since by the farmer of the surrounding acres for less pretentious and more commodious headquarters. Among others, Miss Carnot, the Gallic Sappho, at one time made it her home, and later on an old man named Williams became its occupier. The foul murder of this tenant by his 2 sons was the cause of its remaining for some considerable period uninhabited, with the inevitable consequence of its undergoing very extensive dilapidation. The house had got a bad name, and adolescent man and nature combined to bring swift desolation upon it. The fear of the Williamses, which kept the Shathuth lads from gratifying their propensity to invade its deserted interior, manifested itself in unusually destructive resentment against its external breakables. The missiles with which they at once confessed and defied their spiritual dread left scarcely a splinter of glass and only battered relics of the old-fashioned leaden frames in its narrow windows, while numberless shattered tiles about the house and 4 or 5 black apertures yawning behind the naked rafters in the roof also witnessed vividly to the energy of their rejection. Rain and wind thus had free way to enter the empty rooms and work their will there, old time aiding and abetting. Alternately soaked and desiccated, the planks of flooring and wainscot warped apart strangely, split here and there, and tore themselves away in paroxysms of rheumatic pain from the rust-devoured nails that had once held them firm. The plaster of walls and ceiling, growing green-black with a rain-fed crust of lowly life, parted slowly from the fermenting laths, and large fragments thereof falling down inexplicably in tranquil hours, with loud concussion and clatter, gave strength to the popular superstition that old Williams and his sons were fated to reenact their fearful tragedy until the final judgment. White roses and dædal creepers, that Miss Carnot had first adorned the walls with, spread now luxuriantly over the lichen-filmed tiles of the roof, and in slender, graceful sprays timidly invaded the ghostly cobweb-draped apartments. Fungi, sickly pale, began to displace and uplift the bricks in the cellar floor, while on the rotting wood everywhere they clustered, in all the glory of the purple and mottled crimson, yellow-brown and hepatite. Wood-lice and ants, beetles and moths, winged and creeping things innumerable, found each day a more congenial home among the ruins. And after them, in ever-increasing multitudes, swarmed the blotchy toads. Swallows and martins built every year more thickly in the silent, airy upper chambers. Bats and owls struggled for the crepuscular corners of the lower rooms. Thus, in the spring of the year 1887, was nature taking over, gradually but certainly, the tenancy of the old manse. The house was falling into decay, as men who do not appreciate the application of human derelicts to other beings' use would say, surely and swiftly. But it was destined nevertheless to shelter another human tenant before its final dissolution. There was no intelligence of the advent of a new inhabitant in quiet Shathuth. He came without a solitary premonition out of the vast unknown into the sphere of minute village observation and gossip. He fell into the Shathuth world, as it were, like a thunderbolt falling in the daytime. Suddenly, out of nothingness, he was. Rumour, indeed, vaguely averred that he was seen to arrive by a certain train from London, and to walk straight without hesitation to the old manse, giving neither explanatory word nor sign to mortal as to his purpose there. But then the same fertile source of information also hinted that he was first beheld skimming down the slopes of steep Pennapush with exceeding swiftness, riding, as it appeared to the intelligent observer, upon an instrument not unlike a sieve, and that he entered the house by the chimney. Of these conflicting reports, the former was the first to be generally circulated, but the latter, in view of the bizarre presence and eccentric ways of the newest inhabitant, obtained wider credence. By whatever means he arrived, there can be no doubt that he was in possession of the manse on the 1st of May, because on the morning of that day he was inspected by Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones, and subsequently by the numerous persons her report brought up the mountain slope, engaged in the curious occupation of nailing sheet tin across the void window sockets of his new domicile, blinding his house, as Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones not inaptly termed it. He was a small-bodied, sallow-faced little man, clad in a close-fitting garment of some stiff, dark material, which Mr. Perry Davies, the Sheffield shoemaker, opined was leather. His aquiline nose, thin lips, high cheek ridges, and pointed chin were all small and mutually well proportioned, but the bones and muscles of his face were rendered excessively prominent and distinct by his extreme leanness. The same cause contributed to the sunken appearance of the large, eager-looking grey eyes that gazed forth from under his phenomenally wide and high forehead. It was this latter feature that most powerfully attracted the attention of an observer. It seemed to be great beyond all preconceived ratio to the rest of his countenance. Dimensions, corrugations, wrinkled venation were all abnormally exaggerated. Below it, his eyes glowed like lights in some cave at cliff's foot. It so overpowered and suppressed the rest of his face as to give an unhuman appearance almost, to what would otherwise have been an unquestionably handsome profile. The lank black hair that hung unkempt before his eyes served to increase rather than conceal this effect, by adding to the unnatural altitude a suggestion of hydrocephalic projection, and the idea of something ultra-human was furthermore accentuated by the temporal arteries that pulsated visibly through his transparent yellow skin. No wonder, in view even of these things, that among the highly and overly poetical Sirmic of Sheffield, the sieve theory of arrival found considerable favour. It was his bearing and actions, however, much more than his personality, that won over believers to the warlock notion of matters. In almost every circumstance of life, the observant villagers soon found his ways were not only not their ways, but altogether inexplicable upon any theory of motives they could conceive. Thus, in a small matter at the beginning, when Arthur Price Williams, eminent and famous in every tavern in Caernarvonshire for his social gifts, endeavoured, in choicest Welsh and even choicer English, to inveigle the stranger into conversation over the sheet-tin performance, he failed utterly. Inquisitional supposition, straightforward enquiry, offer of assistance, suggestion of method, sarcasm, irony, abuse, and at last, gage of battle, though shouted with much effort from the road hedge, went unanswered and apparently unheard. Missile weapons, Arthur Price Williams found, were equally unavailing for the purpose of introduction, and the gathered crowd dispersed with unappeased curiosity and suspicion. Later in the day, the swarth apparition was seen striding down the mountain road towards the village, hatless, and with such swift width of step and set resolution of countenance, that Arthur Price Williams, beholding him from afar from the Pig and Whistle doorway, was seized with dire consternation, and hid behind the Dutch oven in the kitchen till he was past. Wild panic also smote the schoolhouse, as the children were coming out, and drove them indoors like leaves before a gale. He was merely seeking the provision shop, however, and erupted thenceforth after a prolonged stay, loaded with a various armful of blue parcels, a loaf, herrings, pig's trotters, salt pork, and a black bottle, with which he returned in the same swift projectile gait to the manse. His way of shopping was to name, and to name simply, without solitary other word of explanation, civility, or request, the article he required. The shopkeeper's crude meteorological superstitions and inquisitive commonplaces he seemed not to hear, and he might have been esteemed deaf if he had not evinced the promptest attention to the faintest relevant remark. Consequently, it was speedily rumoured that he was determined to avoid all but the most necessary human intercourse. He lived altogether mysteriously, in the decaying manse, without mortal service or companionship, presumably sleeping on planks or litter, and either preparing his own food or eating it raw. This, coupled with the popular conception of the haunting patricides, did much to strengthen the popular superstition of some vast gulf between the newcomer and common humanity. The only thing that was inharmonious with this idea of severance from mankind was a constant flux of crates filled with grotesquely contorted glassware, cases of brazen and steel instruments, huge coils of wire, vast iron and fire-clay implements of inconceivable purpose, jars and phials labeled in black and scarlet, poison, huge packages of books, and gargantuan rolls of cartridge paper, which set in towards his Shathuth quarters from the outer world. The apparently hieroglyphic inscriptions on these various consignments revealed, at the profound scrutiny of Pug Jones, that the style and title of the new inhabitant was Dr. Moses Nebogipfel, Ph.D., F.R.S., N.W.R., paid, at which discovery much edification was felt, especially among the purely Welsh-speaking community. Further than this, these arrivals, by their evident unfitness for any allowable mortal use, and inferential diabolicalness, filled the neighbourhood with a vague horror and lively curiosity, which were greatly augmented by the extraordinary phenomena, and still more extraordinary accounts thereof, that followed their reception in the manse. The first of these was on Wednesday, the 15th of May, when the Calvinistic Methodists of Shathuth had their annual commemoration festival, on which occasion, in accordance with custom, dwellers in the surrounding parishes of Rustog, Pendigarin, Cairgasheth, St. Erith, and even distant Shenrust, flocked into the village. Popular thanks to Providence were materialized in the usual way, by means of plum bread and butter, mixed tea, terza, consecrated flirtations, kiss in the ring, rough-and-tumble football, and vituperative political speech-making. About 8:30 the fun began to tarnish, and the assembly to break up, and by 9 numerous couples and occasional groups were wending their way in the darkling along the hilly Shathuth and Rustog road. It was a calm, warm night, one of those nights when lamps, gas, and heavy sleep seem stupid ingratitude to the Creator. The zenith sky was an ineffable deep lucent blue, and the evening star hung golden in the liquid darkness of the west. In the north-northwest a faint phosphorescence marked the sunken day. The moon was just rising, pallid and gibbous over the huge haze-dimmed shoulder of the Penipus. Against the wan eastern sky, from the vague outline of the mountain slope, the manse stood out black, clear, and solitary. The stillness of the twilight had hushed the myriad murmurs of the day. Only the sounds of footsteps and voices and laughter that came fitfully rising and falling from the roadway, and an intermittent hammering in the darkened dwelling broke the silence. Suddenly a strange whizzing, buzzing whir filled the night air, and a bright flicker glanced across the dim path of the wayfarers. All eyes were turned in astonishment to the old manse. The house no longer loomed a black, featureless block, but was filled to overflowing with light. From the gaping holes in the roof, from chinks and fissures amid tiles and brickwork, from every gap which nature or man had pierced in the crumbling old shell, a blinding blue-white glare was streaming, beside which the rising moon seemed a disk of opaque sulphur. The thin mist of the dewy night had caught the violet glow, and hung, unearthly smoke, over the colourless blaze. A strange turmoil and outcrying in the old manse now began, and grew ever more audible to the clustering spectators, and therewith came clanging loud impacts against the window-guarding tin. Then from the gleaming roof-gaps of the house suddenly vomited forth a wondrous swarm of heteromerous living things, swallows, sparrows, martins, owls, bats, insects in visible multitudes, to hang for many minutes, a noisy, gyring, spreading cloud over the black gables and chimneys, and then slowly to thin out and vanish away in the night. As this tumult died away, the throbbing humming that had first arrested attention grew once more in the listener's hearing, until at last it was the only sound in the long stillness. Presently, however, the road gradually awoke again to the beating and shuffling of feet, as the knots of Rustog people, one by one, turned their blinking eyes from the dazzling whiteness, and, pondering deeply, continued their homeward way. The cultivated reader will have already discerned that this phenomena, which sowed a whole crop of uncanny thoughts in the minds of these worthy folk, was simply the installation of the electric light in the manse. Truly, this last vicissitude of the old house was its strangest one. Its revival to mortal life was like the raising of Lazarus. From that hour forth, by night and day, behind the tin-blinded windows, the tamed lightning illuminated every corner of its quickly changing interior. The almost frenzied energy of the lank-haired, leather-clad little doctor swept away into obscure holes and corners, and common destruction, creeper sprays, toadstools, rose leaves, birds' nests, birds' eggs, cobwebs, and all the coatings and lovingly fanciful trimmings with which that maternal old daughter, Dame Nature, had tricked out the decaying house for its lying-in state. The magneto-electric apparatus whirred incessantly amid the vestiges of the wainscoted dining-room, where once the 18th-century tenant had piously read morning prayer and eaten his Sunday dinner. And in the place of his sacred symbolic sideboard was a nasty heap of coke. The oven of the bakehouse supplied substratum and the material for a forge, whose snorting, panting bellows and intermittent ruddy spark-light and blast made the benighted but Bible-lit Welsh women murmur in liquid cermic as they hurried by. Whose breath kindleth coals, and out of his mouth is a flame of fire. For the idea these good people formed of it was that a tame but occasionally restive Leviathan had been added to the terrors of the haunted house. The constantly increasing accumulation of pieces of machinery, big brass castings, block tin, casks, crates, and packages of innumerable articles, by their demands for space, necessitated the sacrifice of most of the slighter partitions of the house, and the beams and flooring of the upper chambers were also mercilessly sawn away by the tireless scientist, in such a way as to convert them into mere shelves and corner brackets of the arterial space between the cellars and rafters. Some of the sounder planking was utilized in the making of a rude, broad table, upon which files and heaps of geometrical diagrams speedily accumulated. The production of these latter seemed to be the object upon which the mind of Dr. Nebelgifel was so inflexibly set. All other circumstances of his life were made entirely subsidiary to this one occupation. Strangely complicated traceries of lines they were, plans, elevations, sections by surfaces and solids, that, with the help of logarithmic mechanical apparatus and involved curvigraphical machines, spread swiftly under his expert hands over yard after yard of paper. Some of these symbolized shapes he dispatched to London, and they presently returned, realized in forms of brass and ivory and nickel and mahogany. Some of them he himself translated into solid models of metal and wood, occasionally casting the metallic ones in molds of sand, but often laboriously hewing them out of the block for greater precision of dimension. In this second process, among other appliances, he employed a steel circular saw set with diamond powder, and made to rotate with extraordinary swiftness by means of steam and multiplying gear. It was this latter thing, more than all else, that filled Shathuth with a sickly loathing of the doctor as a man of blood and darkness. Often in the silence of midnight, for the newest inhabitant heeded the sun but little in his incessant research, the awakened dwellers around Pennapush would hear what was at first a complaining murmur, like the groaning of a wounded man, grrrr, rising by slow gradations in pitch and intensity to the likeness of a voice in despairing, passionate protest, and at last ending abruptly in a sharp, piercing shriek that rang in the ears for hours afterward, and begot numberless gruesome dreams. The mystery of all these unearthly noises and inexplicable phenomena, the doctor's inhumanly brusque bearing, and evident uneasiness when away from his absorbing occupation, his entire and jealous seclusion, and his terrifying behavior to certain officious intruders, roused popular resentment and curiosity to the highest, and a plot was already on foot to make some sort of popular inquisition, probably accompanied by an experimental ducking, into his proceedings when the sudden death of the hunchback Hughes in a fit brought matters to an unexpected crisis. It happened in broad daylight, in the roadway just opposite the manse. 6 people witnessed it. The unfortunate creature was seen to fall suddenly and roll about on the pathway, struggling violently, as it appeared to the spectators, with some invisible assailant. When assistance reached him, he was purple in the face, and his blue lips were covered with glary foam. He died almost as soon as they laid hands on him. Owen Thomas, the general practitioner, vainly assured the excited crowd which speedily gathered outside the Pig and Whistle, whither the body had been carried, that the death was unquestionably natural. A horrible zymotic suspicion had gone forth that the deceased was the victim of Dr. Nebelgifeld's imputed aerial powers. The contagion was with the news that passed like a flash through the village, and set all Shetheth seething with a fierce desire for action against the worker of this iniquity. Downright superstition, which had previously walked somewhat modestly about the village, in the fear of ridicule and the doctor, now appeared boldly before the sight of all men, clad in the terrible majesty of truth. People who had hitherto kept entire silence as to their fears of the imp-like philosopher suddenly discovered a fearsome pleasure in whispering dread possibilities to kindred souls, and from whispers of possibilities their sympathy-fostered utterances soon developed into unhesitating asseverations in loud and even high-pitched tones. The fancy of a captive Leviathan, already alluded to, which had up to now been the horrid but secret joy of a certain conclave of ignorant old women, was published to all the world as indisputable fact, it being stated on her own authority that the animal had on one occasion chased Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones almost into Rustog. The story that Nebugiffel had been heard within the manse chanting, in conjunction with the Williamses' horrible blasphemy, and that a black flapping thing of the size of a young calf had thereupon entered the gap in the roof, was universally believed in. A grisly anecdote that owed its origination to a stumble in the churchyard was circulated to the effect that the doctor had been caught ghoulishly tearing with his long white fingers at a new-made grave. The numerously attested declaration that Nebugiffel and the murdered Williams had been seen hanging the sons on a ghostly gibbet at the back of the house was due to the electric illumination of a fitfully wind-shaken tree. 100 like stories hurtled thickly about the village and darkened the moral atmosphere. The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, hearing of the tumult, sallied forth to allay it, and narrowly escaped drawing on himself the gathering lightning. By 8 o'clock, it was Monday, the 22nd of July, a grand demonstration had organized itself against the necromancer. A number of bolder hearts among the men formed the nucleus of the gathering, and at nightfall Arthur Price Williams, John Peters, and others brought torches and raised their spark-raining flames aloft with curt, ominous suggestions. The less adventurous village manhood came straggling late to the rendezvous, and with them the married women came in groups of 4 or 5, greatly increasing the excitement of the assembly with their shrill, hysterical talk and active imaginations. After these, the children and young girls, overcome by undefinable dread, crept quietly out of the too silent and shadowy houses into the yellow glare of the pine knots and the tumultuary noise of the thickening people. By 9, nearly half the Shetheth population was massed before the Pig and Whistle. There was a confused murmur of many tongues, but above all the stir and chatter of the growing crowd could be heard the coarse, cracked voice of the bloodthirsty old fanatic Pritchard, drawing a congenial lesson from the fate of the 450 idolaters of Carmel. Just as the church clock was beating out the hour, an occultly originated movement up the hill began, and soon the whole assembly, men, women, and children, was moving in a fear-compacted mass towards the ill-fated doctor's abode. As they left the brightly lit public house behind them, a quavering female voice began singing one of those grim-sounding canticles that so satisfy the Calvinistic ear. In a wonderfully short time the tune had been caught up, first by 2 or 3, and then by the whole procession, and the manifold shuffling of heavy shoon grew swiftly into rhythm with the beats of the hymn. When, however, their goal rose like a blazing star over the undulation of the road, the volume of the chanting suddenly dried away, leaving only the voices of the ringleaders, shouting indeed now somewhat out of tune, but if anything more vigorously than before. Their persistence and example nevertheless failed to prevent a perceptible breaking and slackening of the pace. As the manse was neared, and when the gate was reached, the whole crowd came to a dead halt. Vague fear for the future had begotten the courage that had brought the villagers thus far. Fear for the present now smothered its kindred birth. The intense blaze from the gaps in the death-light silent pile lit up rows of livid, hesitating faces, and a smothered, frightened sobbing broke out among the children. "Well," said Arthur Price Williams, addressing Jack Peters, with an expert assumption of the modest discipleship, "what do we do now, Jack?" But Peters was regarding the manse with manifest dubiety and ignored the question. The Shetheth witch-find seemed to be suddenly aborting. At this juncture old Pritchard suddenly pushed his way forward, gesticulating weirdly with his bony hands and long arms. "What?" he shouted in broken notes. "Fear ye to smite when the Lord hateth? Burn the warlock!" And, seizing a flambeau from Peters, he flung open the rickety gate and strode on down the drive, his torch leaving a coiling trail of scintillant sparks on the night wind. "Burn the warlock!" screamed a shrill voice from the wavering crowd, and in a moment the gregarious human instinct had prevailed. With an outburst of incoherent, threatening voice, the mob poured after the fanatic. Woe betide the philosopher now. They expected barricaded doors, but with a groan of conscious insufficiency, the hinge-rusted portal swung at the push of Pritchard. Blinded by the light, he hesitated for a second on the threshold, while his followers came crowding up behind him. Those who were there say they saw Dr. Nebelgifel standing in the toneless electric glare, on a peculiar erection of brass and ebony and ivory, and that he seemed to be smiling at them, half pityingly and half scornfully, as it is said martyrs are wont to smile. Some assert, moreover, that by his side was sitting a tall man, clad in raven's wing, and some even aver that this second man, whom others deny, bore on his face the likeness of the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, while others declare that he resembled the description of the murdered Williams. Be that as it may, it must now go unproven forever, for suddenly a wondrous thing smote the crowd as it swarmed in through the entrance. Pritchard pitched headlong on the floor senseless, while shouts and shrieks of anger changed in mid-utterance to yells of agonizing fear, or to the mute gasp of heart-stopping horror, and then a frantic rush was made for the doorway. For the calm, smiling doctor and his quiet, black-clad companion and the polished platform which upbore them had vanished before their eyes. Section 2. How an esoteric story became possible. A silvery foliaged willow by the size of a mirror. Out of the crest-spangled waters below rise clumps of sedge blades, and among them glows the purple fleur-de-lis, the sapphire vapor of forget-me-nots. Beyond is the sluggish stream of water reflecting the intense blue of the moist fenland sky, and beyond that a low osier-fringed eyot. This limits all the visible universe, save some scattered pollards and spear-like poplars showing against the violet distance. At the foot of the willow reclines the author, watching a copper butterfly fluttering from iris to iris. Who can fix the colors of the sunset? Who can take a cast of flame? Let him essay to register the mutations of mortal thought as it wanders from a copper butterfly to the disembodied soul, and thence passes to spiritual motions and the vanishing of Dr. Moses Nebelgifel and the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook from the world of sense. But as the author lay basking there and speculating, as another once did under the boo tree, on mystic transmutations, a presence became apparent. There was a somewhat on the eyot between him and the purple horizon, an opaque reflecting entity, making itself dimly perceptible by reflection in the water to his averted eyes. He raised them in curious surprise. What was it? He stared in stupefied astonishment at the apparition, doubted, blinked, rubbed his eyes, stared again, and believed. It was solid, it cast a shadow, and it upbore two men. There was white metal in it that blazed in the noontide sun like incandescent magnesium, ebony bars that drank in the light, and white parts that gleamed like polished ivory, yet withal it seemed unreal. The thing was not square, as a machine ought to be, but all awry. It was twisted and seemed falling over, hanging in two directions, as those queer crystals called triclinic hang. It seemed like a machine that had been crushed or warped. It was suggestive and not confirmatory, like the machine of a disordered dream. The men, too, were dreamlike. One was short, intensely sallow, with a strangely shaped head, and clad in a garment of dark green. The other was grotesquely out of place, evidently a clergyman of the established church, a fair-haired, pale-faced, respectable-looking man. Once more doubt came rushing in on the author. He sprawled back and stared at the sky, rubbed his eyes, stared at the willow wands that hung between him and the blue, closely examined his hands to see if his eyes had got any new things to relate about them, and then sat up again and stared at the eyot. A gentle breeze stirred the osiers. A white bird was flapping its way through the lower sky. The machine of the vision had vanished. It was an illusion, a projection of the subjective, an assertion of the immateriality of the mind. Yes, interpolated the skeptic faculty, but how comes it that the clergyman is still there? The clergyman had not vanished. In intense perplexity, the author examined this black-coated phenomena as he stood regarding the world with hand-shaded eyes. The author knew the periphery of that ayat by heart, and the question that troubled him was whence? The clergyman looked as Frenchmen look when they land at New Haven, intensely travel-worn. His clothes showed rubbed and seamy in the bright day. When he came to the edge of the island and shouted a question to the author, his voice was broken and trembled. "Yes," answered the author, "it is an island. How did you get there?" But the clergyman, instead of replying to this, asked a very strange question. He said, "Are you in the 19th century?" The author made him repeat that question before he replied. "Thank heaven!" cried the clergyman rapturously. Then he asked very eagerly for the exact date. "August 9th, 1887, he repeated after the author. "Heaven be praised!" And sinking down on the ayat so that the sedges hid him, he audibly burst into tears. Now the author was mightily surprised at all this, and going a certain distance along the mare, he obtained a punt, and getting into it he hastily pulled to the ayat where he had last seen the clergyman. He found him lying insensible among the reeds, and carried him in his punt to the house where he lived, and the clergyman lay there insensible for 10 days. Meanwhile it became known that he was the Reverend Elijah Cook, who had disappeared from Sidwood with Dr. Moses Nebogipfel 3 weeks before. On August 19th, the nurse called the author out of his study to speak to the invalid. He found him perfectly sensible, but his eyes were strangely bright and his face was deadly pale. "Have you found out who I am?" he asked. "You are the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, Master of Arts of Pembroke College, Oxford, and Rector of Shethuth, near Rosteg in Caernarvon." He bowed his head. "Have you been told anything of how I came here?" "I found you among the reeds," I said. He was silent and thoughtful for a while. "I have a deposition to make. Will you take it?" "It concerns the murder of an old man named Williams, which occurred in 1862. This disappearance of Dr. Moses Nebogipfel, the abduction of a ward in the year 4003. The author stared. "The year of our Lord 4003, he corrected. "She would come. Also several assaults on public officials in the years 17,901 and 2. The author coughed. "The years 17,901 and 2, and valuable medical, social, and physiographical data for all time." After a consultation with the doctor, it was decided to have the deposition taken down, and this is which constitutes the remainder of the story of the chronic Argonauts. On August 28, 1887, the Reverend Elijah Cook died. His body was conveyed to Shethuth and buried in the churchyard there. Section 3. The esoteric story based on the clergyman's depositions. The anachronic man. Incidentally, it has been remarked in the first part how the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook attempted and failed to quiet the superstitious excitement of the villagers on the afternoon of the memorable 22nd of July. His next proceeding was to try and warn the unsocial philosopher of the dangers which impended. With this intent, he made his way from the rumor-pelted village, through the silent, slumbrous heat of the July afternoon, up the slopes of the Pennepush to the old manse. His loud knocking at the heavy door called forth dull resonance from the interior, and produced a shower of lumps of plaster and fragments of decaying touchwood from the rickety porch. But beyond this, the dreamy stillness of the summer midday remained unbroken. Everything was so quiet as he stood there expectant, that the occasional speech of the haymakers a mile away in the fields, over towards Rostog, could be distinctly heard. The reverend gentleman waited, then knocked again, and waited again, and listened, until the echoes and the patter of rubbish had melted away into the deep silence, and the creeping in the blood vessels of his ears had become oppressively audible, swelling and sinking with sounds like the confused murmuring of a distant crowd, and causing a suggestion of anxious discomfort to spread slowly over his mind. Again he knocked, this time loud, quick blows with his stick, and almost immediately afterwards, leaning his hand against the door, he kicked the panels vigorously. There was a shouting of echoes, a protesting jarring of hinges, and then the oaken door yawned and displayed, in the blue blaze of the electric light, vestiges of partitions, piles of planking and straw, masses of metal, heaps of papers, and overthrown apparatus, to the rector's astonished eyes. "Dr. Nebugiffel, excuse my intruding," he called out. But the only response was the reverberation among the black beams and shadows that hung dimly above. For almost a minute he stood there, leaning forward over the threshold, staring at the glittering mechanisms, diagrams, books, scattered indiscriminately with broken food, packing cases, heaps of coke, hay, and microcosmic lumber, about the undivided house cavity. And then, removing his hat and treading stealthily as if the silence were a sacred thing, he stepped into the apparently deserted shelter of the doctor. His eyes sought everywhere as he cautiously made his way through the confusion, with a strange anticipation of finding Nebugiffel hidden somewhere in the sharp black shadows among the litter. So strong in him was an indescribable sense of perceiving presence. This feeling was so vivid that when, after an abortive exploration, he seated himself upon Nebugiffel's diagram-covered bench, it made him explain in a forced, hoarse voice to the stillness, "He is not here. I have something to say to him. I must wait for him." It was so vivid, too, that the trickling of some grit down the wall in the vacant corner behind him made him start round in sudden perspiration. There was nothing visible there, but turning his head back, he was stricken rigid with horror by the swift, noiseless apparition of Nebugiffel, ghastly pale, and with red-stained hands, crouching upon a strange-looking metallic platform, with his deep grey eyes looking intently into the visitor's face. Cook's first impulse was to yell out his fear, but his throat was paralyzed, and he could only stare fascinated at the bizarre countenance that had thus clashed suddenly into visibility. The lips were quivering, and the breath came in short, convulsive sobs. The unhuman forehead was wet with perspiration, while the veins were swollen, knotted, and purple. The doctor's red hands, too, he noticed, were trembling, as the hands of slight people tremble after intense muscular exertion, and his lips closed and opened as if he, too, had a difficulty in speaking, as he gasped, "What do you do here?" Cook answered not a word, but stared with hair erect, open mouth, and dilated eyes at the dark red, unmistakable smear that streaked the pure ivory and gleaming nickel and shining ebony of the platform. "What are you doing here?" repeated the doctor, raising himself. "What do you want?" Cook gave a convulsive effort. "In heaven's name, what are you?" he gasped, and then black curtains came closing in from every side, sweeping the squatting dwarfish phantasm that reeled before him into rayless, voiceless night. The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook recovered his perceptions to find himself lying on the floor of the old manse, and Dr. Nebugiffel, no longer blood-stained and with all trace of his agitation gone, kneeling by his side and bending over him with a glass of brandy in his hand. "Do not be alarmed, sir," said the philosopher with a faint smile, as the clergyman opened his eyes. "I have not treated you to a disembodied spirit, or anything nearly so extraordinary. May I offer you this?" The clergyman submitted quietly to the brandy, and then stared perplexed into Nebugiffel's face, vainly searching his memory for what occurrences had preceded his insensibility. Raising himself at last into a sitting posture, he saw the oblique mass of metal that had appeared with the doctor, and immediately all that happened flashed back upon his mind. He looked from this structure to the recluse, and from the recluse to the structure. "There is absolutely no deception, sir," said Nebugiffel, with the slightest trace of mockery in his voice. "I lay no claim to work in matters spiritual. It is a bona fide mechanical contrivance, a thing emphatically of this sordid world. Excuse me, just 1 minute." He rose from his knees, stepped upon the mahogany platform, took a curiously curved lever in his hand, and pulled it over. Cook rubbed his eyes. There certainly was no deception. The doctor and the machine had vanished. The reverend gentleman felt no horror this time, only a slight nervous shock, to see the doctor presently reappear in the twinkling of an eye, and get down from the machine. From that he walked in a straight line with his hands behind his back, and his face downcast, until his progress was stopped by the intervention of a circular saw. Then, turning round sharply on his heel, he said, "I was thinking while I was away. Would you like to come? I should greatly value a companion." The clergyman was sitting hatless on the floor. "I am afraid," he said slowly, "you will think me stupid." "Not at all," interrupted the doctor. "The stupidity is mine. You desire to have all this explained. Wish to know where I am going first. I have spoken so little with men of this age for the last 10 years or more that I have ceased to make due allowances and concessions for other minds. I will do my best, but that I fear will be very unsatisfactory. It is a long story. Do you find that floor comfortable to sit on? If not, there is a nice packing case over there, or some straw behind you, or this bench. The diagrams are done with now, but I am afraid of the drawing pins. You may sit on the chronic Argo." "No, thank you," slowly replied the clergyman, eyeing that deformed structure thus indicated suspiciously. "I am quite comfortable here." "Then I will begin. Do you read fables, modern ones?" "I'm afraid I must confess to a good deal of fiction," said the clergyman deprecatingly. "In Wales, the ordained ministers of the sacraments of the Church have perhaps too large a share of leisure. Have you read The Ugly Duckling?" "Hans Christian Andersen's? Yes, in my childhood." "A wonderful story, a story that has ever been full of tears and heart-swelling hopes for me, since first it came to me in my lonely boyhood and saved me from unspeakable things. That story, if you understand it well, will tell you almost all that you should know of me, to comprehend how that machine came to be thought of in a mortal brain. Even when I read that simple narrative for the first time, 1,000 bitter experiences had begun the teaching of my isolation among the people of my birth. I knew the story was for me. The ugly duckling that proved to be a swan, that lived through all contempt and bitterness to float at last sublime. From that hour forth I dreamt of meeting with my kind, dreamt of encountering that sympathy I knew was my profoundest need. 20 years I lived in that hope, lived and worked, lived and wandered, loved even, and at last despaired. Only once, among all those millions of wandering, astonished, indifferent, contemptuous, and insidious faces that I met with in that passionate wandering, looked one upon me as I desired, looked—" He paused. The Reverend Cook glanced up into his face, expecting some indication of the deep feeling that had sounded in his last words. It was downcast, clouded, and thoughtful, but the mouth was rigidly firm. "In short, Mr. Cook, I discovered that I was one of those superior caggots called a genius, a man born out of my time, a man thinking the thoughts of a wiser age, doing things and believing things that men now cannot understand, and that in the years ordained to me there was nothing but silence and suffering for my soul. Unbroken solitude, man's bitterest pain. I knew I was an anachronic man. My age was still to come. One filmy hope alone held me to life, a hope to which I clung until it had become a certain thing. 30 years of unremitting toil and deepest thought among the hidden things of matter and form and life. And then that, the chronic Argo, the ship that sails through time. And now I go to join my generation, to journey through the ages till my time has come." Section 4. The Chronic Argo. Dr. Nebelgifel paused, looked in sudden doubt at the clergyman's perplexed face. "You think that sounds mad," he said, "to travel through time?" "It certainly jars with accepted opinions," said the clergyman, allowing the faintest suggestion of controversy to appear in his intonation, and speaking apparently to the chronic Argo. "Even a clergyman of the Church of England, you see, can have a suspicion of illusions at times." "It certainly does jar with accepted opinions," agreed the philosopher cordially. "It does more than that. It defies accepted opinions to mortal combat. Opinions of all sorts, Mr. Cook. Scientific theories, laws, articles of belief, or, to come to elements, logical premises, ideas, or whatever you like to call them. All are, from the infinite nature of things, so many diagrammatic caricatures of the ineffable, caricatures altogether to be avoided save where they are necessary in the shaping of results, as chalk outlines are necessary to the painter and plans and sections to the engineer. Men, from the exigencies of their being, find this hard to believe." The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook nodded his head with the quiet smile of one whose opponent has unwittingly given a point. "It is as easy to come to regard ideas as complete reproductions of entities as it is to roll off a log. Hence it is that almost all civilized men believe in the reality of the Greek geometrical conceptions." "Oh, pardon me, sir," interrupted Cook. "Most men know that a geometrical point has no existence in matter, and the same with a geometrical line. I think you underrate—" Yes, those things are recognized," said Nebelgifel calmly. "But now a cube. Does that exist in the material universe?" Certainly. An instantaneous cube? I don't know what you intend by that expression. Without any other sort of extension. A body having length, breadth, and thickness exists. What other sort of extension can there be? Asked Cook with raised eyebrows. Has it never occurred to you that no form can exist in the material universe that has no extension in time? Has it never glimmered upon your consciousness that nothing stood between men and a geometry of 4 dimensions, length, breadth, thickness, and duration, but the inertia of opinion, the impulse from the Levantine philosophers of the Bronze Age? Putting it that way, said the clergyman, it does look as though there was a flaw somewhere in the notion of tridimensional being. But he became silent, leaving that sufficiently eloquent but to convey all the prejudice and distrust that filled his mind. When we take up this new light of a 4th dimension and re-examine our physical science in its illumination, continued Nebelgipfel after a pause, we find ourselves no longer limited by hopeless restriction to a certain beat of time, to our own generation. Locomotion along lines of duration, chronic navigation, comes within the range first of geometrical theory and then of practical mechanics. There was a time when men could move only horizontally and in their appointed country. The clouds floated above them unattainable things, mysterious chariots of those fearful gods who dwelt among the mountain summits. Speaking practically, men in those days were restricted to motion in 2 dimensions, and even their circumambient ocean and hyperborean fear bound him in. But those times were to pass away. First the keel of Jason cut its way between the Symplegades, and then in the fullness of time Columbus dropped anchor in a bay of Atlantis. Then man burst his bi-dimensional limits and invaded the 3rd dimension, soaring with Montgolfier into the clouds, and sinking with a diving bell into the purple treasure caves of the waters. And now another step, and the hidden past and unknown future are before us. We stand upon a mountain summit with the plains of the ages spread below. Nebelgipfel paused and looked down at his hearer. The Reverend Elijah Cook was sitting with an expression of strong distrust on his face. Preaching much had brought home certain truths to him very vividly, and he always suspected rhetoric. Are those things figures of speech, he asked, or am I to take them as precise statements? Do you speak of traveling through time in the same way as one might speak of omnipotence making his pathway on the storm? Or do you, mean what you say? Dr. Nebelgipfel smiled quietly. Come and look at these diagrams, he said, and then, with elaborate simplicity, he commenced to explain again to the clergyman the new quadridimensional geometry. Insensibly, Cook's aversion passed away, and seeming impossibility grew possible, now that such tangible things as diagrams and models could be brought forward in evidence. Presently he found himself asking questions, and his interest grew deeper and deeper, as Nebelgipfel slowly and with precise clearness unfolded the beautiful order of his strange invention. The moments slipped away unchecked as the doctor passed on to the narrative of his research, and it was with a start of surprise that the clergyman noticed the deep blue of the dying twilight through the open doorway. The voyage, said Nebelgipfel, concluding his history, will be full of undreamt of dangers. Already in one brief essay I have stood in the very jaws of death. But it is also full of the divine's promise of undreamt of joy. Will you come? Will you walk among the people of the golden years? But the mention of death by the philosopher had brought flooding back to the mind of Cook all the horrible sensations of that first apparition. Dr. Nebelgipfel, one question. He hesitated. On your hands, was it blood? Nebelgipfel's countenance fell. He spoke slowly. When I had stopped my machine, I found myself in this room as it used to be. Hark! It is the wind in the trees towards Rustag. It sounded like the voices of a multitude of people singing. When I had stopped, I found myself in this room as it used to be. An old man, a young man, and a lad were sitting at a table reading some book together. I stood behind them unsuspected. Evil spirits assailed him, read the old man. But it is written, to him that overcometh shall be given life eternal. They came as entreating friends, but he endured through all their snares. They came as principalities and powers, but he defied them in the name of the King of Kings. Once even it is told that in his study, while he was translating the New Testament into German, the evil one himself appeared before him. Just then the lad glanced timorously around, and with a fearful wail fainted away. The others sprang at me. It was a fearful grapple. The old man clung to my throat, screaming, "Man or devil, I defy thee!" I could not help it. We rolled together on the floor. The knife his trembling son had dropped came into my hand. "Hark!" He paused and listened, but Cook remained staring at him in the same horror-stricken attitude he had assumed when the memory of the blood-stained hands had rushed back over his mind. "Do you hear what they are crying? Hark! Burn the warlock! Burn the murderer! Do you hear? There is no time to be lost. Slay the murderer of cripples! Kill the devil's claw!" "Come, come!" Cook, with a convulsive effort, made a gesture of repugnance and strode to the doorway. A crowd of black figures roaring towards him in the red torchlight made him recoil. He shut the door and faced Nebogipfel. The thin lips of the doctor curled with a contemptuous sneer. "They will kill you if you stay," he said, and seizing his unresisting visitor by the wrist, he forced him towards the glittering machine. Cook sat down and covered his face with his hands. In another moment the door was flung open and old Pritchard stood blinking on the threshold. A pause. A hoarse shout changing suddenly into a sharp, shrill shriek. A thunderous roar like the bursting forth of a great fountain of water. The voyage of the Chronic Argonauts had begun. End of The Chronic Argonauts by H.G. Wells.